Welcome to All Those Kings, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Today is our ninth and last class, and we're going to be talking about the Babylonian exile and bringing the book of Kings to a close. It's always kind of sad to finish up because this is such fun for me. Last time we talked about the destruction of the northern kingdom. The city of Samaria was destroyed by the Assyrians. And 20 years later, the Assyrians, during the time of Hezekiah, attacked the city of Jerusalem because Hezekiah had conspired against the Assyrians. Fortunately, the Lord intervened. The Assyrian army was destroyed in some fashion, and we speculated a little bit about that last time. The question being, how is it that the men actually died? It was something very, very quick. It happened overnight. We don't know, but in some fashion, the Assyrian army was nearly destroyed, and the king of Assyria had to withdraw, and Assyria never again threatened the city of Jerusalem for the next 125 years. However, the kingdom of Judah, as a penalty and as a result of the rebellion, had been so badly damaged by the Assyrian attacks that over the next 125 years, basically, they limped through as a tiny little colony surrounded by an Assyrian empire. And one king after another, following Hezekiah, abandoned the proper worship of Yahweh, worship of the Lord, and as a result, eventually Jerusalem was destroyed, but by a different enemy entirely, the Babylonians, and we're going to talk about that today. When Hezekiah died, he had tried to restore the faith of Yahweh. He had destroyed high places and altars. He had reestablished the proper worship. But when he died, his son, Manasseh, we are told, was 12 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 55 years. He was an absolutely monstrous king. He reverted back to the worship of the various pagan gods. And this happened regularly in the ancient world when you had an assortment of gods from which you could choose who was going to be the dominant god, because if there was a failure in your kingdom, or if you were destroyed, or if you were attacked, or if things hadn't gone well, it wasn't uncommon to switch gods. And Manasseh, maybe growing up and watching what the Assyrians had done while his father Hezekiah was on the throne, quite possibly reverted to pagan worship. We don't really know why, but the Bible goes on and points out that he did evil in the eyes of Yahweh, following the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. In other words, he reverted back to Canaanite worship for 55 years, and it says he shed so much innocent blood that he filled Jerusalem from end to end. So we have 55 years in Jerusalem where pagan gods are being worshipped, and a tyrant on the throne, people being killed. And when he died, his son Ammon, which incidentally is an Egyptian name. It's kind of curious that an Israelite king would give the name of an Egyptian god to his son, which gives you a sense of what was going on. Ammon was 22 years old when he became king. He reigned in Jerusalem for 2 years. Why only 2 years? It's because he followed the ways of his father and was such a tyrant that his officials conspired against him and assassinated him in his palace within 2 years. Now, as we've talked about, that might be as few as a couple of months, depending on how you count and how it works across the new year. But he was king for a very short time, and then he was assassinated, leaving his son, a young 8-year-old boy named Josiah, on the throne. Now, Josiah would have been a figurehead for several years. There would have been a regent, somebody supervising his education and making decisions in his place. But once he finally became king, he had been on the throne for a total of 31 years. Somehow, he had been exposed to the worship of Yahweh, the worship of the Lord, and he became a believer, and he made a very vigorous, very aggressive attempt to restore the faith of Yahweh to the land. You have to wonder a little bit where he was exposed to that? Who educated him? Because it's a pagan land. There must have been priests of Yahweh who were secretly practicing and preaching in the land, perhaps the way the early Christians were in Rome. They worshiped, they passed on their faith, but they had to hide. And then when Josiah gave them an opportunity, he was converted and he became a believer. It says, Josiah did what was right in the eyes of Yahweh, not turning aside to the right or to the left. He was a strong believer, and during his 13th year, something happened that may have played a part in this. It says, the word of Yahweh came to Jeremiah in the 13th year of the reign of Josiah. Jeremiah is one of the greatest of the prophets, and he was in the region of Jerusalem, and apparently during the 13th year, which would have made Josiah maybe 20, 21 years old, and Jeremiah would have had a significant influence on his thinking. And then just a few years after that, something very dramatic happened. And it says in the 18th year of Josiah's reign, he would be in his mid-20s at this point, Hilkiah the high priest said, and this was while they were working to repair the temple, he said, I have found the book of the law in the temple of the Lord. Now, we can derive from this that the temple was in disrepair. It had been under pagan control for 75, 80, 90 years. It was already a 350-year-old building, made of big stones and timbers, and would have required an enormous amount of maintenance anyway. But at this point, apparently it had fallen into disrepair, was full of trash. Josiah decided that he would commission a work crew to go in and clean it up. And while they were digging around in the trash, they found some kind of a document back in the corner. And there's been a lot of debate about what the book of the law was. The general consensus today is that it was the book of Deuteronomy. It may have been the Torah. There are some arguments pro and con in that sense. But the point is, he found a book that listed all of the things that people were expected to do in the worship of Yahweh. And it turns out that they weren't doing a lot of those things. They weren't observing the Passover properly. He was devastated by it, and he very aggressively, following what was in this book of the law, began to prosecute the Baalist religions, tear down the high places. He killed some of the priests, burned their bones, and put the ashes on the altars to desecrate the pagan altars so they couldn't be used again. In other words, very aggressively, he tried to return the country to the faith of Yahweh. And again, a question that you can ask historically is, how was he able to do this? They were surrounded by Assyrians, and if you look at the various places that he destroyed altars, some of those were up in what would have been the kingdom of Israel, up in Bethel and some of the places that would have been controlled by Assyrians. And how come he got away with it? He'd have to ride in there with soldiers, and they would have to take the priests prisoners, and then they would be desecrating worship sites. There would have been resistance. And how did he get away with it? And that's because there was a dramatic change in the geopolitics of the world at that time. If we look at where Israel and Judah had been, the divided kingdom, and the small kingdom of the Arameans, you can see that these are tiny little regions in a big ancient Near Eastern world. You have Egypt down to the southwest. The Assyrians, over a period of centuries, had been growing in power way off to the east, and they had taken over the entire Fertile Crescent, leaving this little tiny island of Judah at the southwestern end of the Assyrian kingdom. Off to the east, there was a powerful new nation of warlike, semi-nomadic people, loved to gallop around and loot and sack and kill and rape and have fun and then go home. And these are called the Medes. They're up in what would be called Iran today, the Iranian plateau. One of the areas that the Assyrians had conquered was the ancient city of Babylon. The Babylonians had been in control of the southern end of the Fertile Crescent 1,500 years earlier. They'd fallen into decline. They'd been controlled by various other people. But the Assyrians conquered the city of Babylon. And over the last few years, at the time of Josiah, the Babylonians had been rising in power and rebellion the Assyrians had to allow them their own leader, and so they were kind of a second little kingdom down at the base of Assyria. And Assyria was constantly confronting them at this point, trying to keep them under control. But the Babylonian king at that time, the leader, was able to break away, and so we now have an independent Babylon, and Assyria is constantly dealing with Babylon while Josiah is over here, presumably, reestablishing the faith. So we think that's why he was able to get away with it. There was nobody who could pay attention to him at that time. The Babylonian king created an alliance with the Medes. They both hated the Assyrians. The Medes in 614 attacked Ashur, one of their major cities, and destroyed it. Now, the Babylonians had agreed to go up and help them do so, but by the time the Babylonian army arrived, it had already fallen. They missed out on all the fun. They missed out on the looting and the destroying. But they made an agreement that 2 years later they would come back as a coalition and attack the city of Nineveh, which was the major Assyrian capital, and that's what they did. They destroyed the city of Nineveh in 612. There was a remnant of an Assyrian army that fled. They got away, and they fled back to Haran. Now, we've heard about Haran repeatedly. That's where Abraham lived before he moved down into Canaan. That's where his family lived when Isaac went for a bride, and that's where Jacob fled when he had cheated his brother out of his will. And so up in that area, this remnant of an Assyrian army was trying to rebuild itself so that they could maybe make an attempt to regain the kingdom. And the Babylonians charged up to Haran, and in 610, they essentially dispersed what was left of the Assyrian army. So that's where we are at the time of Josiah. This is 1 year before Josiah died. All of this has been taking place over there in Assyria, leaving him the opportunity to reestablish the faith and perhaps control things to a greater degree on his own. At that point, the Babylonians have taken over Assyria, so now it's the same kingdom, it just has different leaders. Same borders, you pay your taxes now to the Babylonians instead of the Assyrians. That's all that's happened. But the Babylonians are now in control with a new king. And we are told at this point that a pharaoh named Necho, and he's a new pharaoh down in Egypt, he's just taken the throne. It says he marched north through Judah. While Josiah was king, Pharaoh Necho went up to the Euphrates River to help the king of Assyria. They've been essentially destroyed up there, but there's still a remnant of Assyrians, and Necho, as an Egyptian, thought it would be preferable for the Egyptians to have a weakened Assyria to the north rather than a rejuvenated, young, aggressive Babylonian kingdom. Presumably that's why he did it, but anyway, he was marching an army up the coast. He sent word to Josiah and said, "We're just passing by. We mean you no harm. Leave us alone." Up in Jerusalem, actually, you're only 40 miles from the Mediterranean down there, and as you go to the edge of the hills, of the foothills, you can actually see on a clear day, you can see the Mediterranean. He would have seen the Egyptian army, the dust, rising up along the coast. Apparently, Josiah was of the opinion that it would be preferable to have the Babylonians in control rather than reverting back to Assyrian control. And so what he did, we are told, we have the Assyrian army up there in Haran. We have the tiny kingdom of Judah up in the hill country, as you see there. And we have Necho marching up the coast. For whatever reason, Josiah put together an army that couldn't have been very strong. He's got a tiny little kingdom. He didn't have time to prepare. He put together some kind of a military force. And it says he marched up to Megiddo, which is where the Egyptian army would have had to pass. He confronted Necho there. They fought a major battle. This was in 609, and unfortunately Josiah was killed. This was a disastrous event as you read through the rest of the book of Kings, because it resulted in the total destruction of Jerusalem. Now, Necho went on up to Haran after this battle, very unhappy, almost certainly, It was costly to put together an army. You would take a long time to assemble it. You'd have your chariots, your horses. You'd have to have spare chariots, spare horses, spare teams, all of your materiel, your weaponry. You had to plan the advance because there's not water for a big army. The Egyptian army would have been probably 20,000 men, 4 divisions of 5,000 men each. And you have to send them up in groups so that they don't overwhelm the water supplies. It was a very costly thing. And he was halfway to his destination when he had to fight a battle he hadn't planned on. Men would have been killed, horses would have been killed, chariots would have been destroyed. You can understand perhaps that Necho would have been very frustrated and angry at events. He went up to Haran. He got there too late to do anything. This last remnant of Assyrians had been dispersed and they were gone. And he turned around and came back. Came back 3 months later. And that leads to what is, in my opinion, a very, very confusing chapter in the Bible. Basically, it's chapter 24 of 2 Kings, where it talks about what happened after Josiah died. We have 20-some years before Jerusalem was destroyed. Josiah had 3 sons, Jehoahaz, Eliakim, and Mattaniah, who were renamed, and a grandson, Jehoiakim. These are the men that are going to take the throne one after the other over the next 20 years. We are told that there was a king for 3 months, and then a king for 11 years, and then a king for 3 months, and a king for 11 years. It sounds kind of contrived and stylized, but that's exactly how it plays out historically. Josiah died in 609, and his son Jehoahaz immediately ascended the throne, while Necho heads up to Haran and comes back through the land, and at this point you can tell he's very angry because he takes Jehoahaz off the throne after he has arrived. He arrives, and this is 3 months after Jehoahaz has taken the throne. Necho comes back, yanks him off the throne, takes him down to Egypt, and he dies there in exile. These are all young men, incidentally. They're in their late teens, early 20s when they take the throne. And then what Necho does is try to put a puppet on the throne in Jerusalem, somebody that will support him and conspire with him. And he puts Eliakim on the throne, renames him Jehoiakim. Now, we are told that Jehoiakim ruled for 11 years. And for the first few years, apparently he worked with the Egyptians. The Babylonians are way off there trying to organize their new kingdom. But a couple of years after Jehoiakim took the throne, who comes knocking at the front door but Nebuchadnezzar, the new king of the Babylonians? He's been out there campaigning throughout his kingdom. He's been up and down the coast fighting the Egyptians for control of the trade routes. And while he's there, he comes up in 605, knocks on the door. He's besieging the city, and he says, "I'm your new king, and you will be my vassal, and you will pay me tribute, and you will behave as though you are part of the Babylonian kingdom. You will stop conspiring with the Egyptians." And what does Jehoiakim say? "Yes, sir." And he starts paying tribute. Before Nebuchadnezzar leaves, he takes a couple of hostages as well, which is a common practice. You would take the sons of the upper class, maybe a prince or two, you'd take them off to as captives, as hostages, as guests, as honored guests, but typically hostages. And they would be there to perhaps prevent conspiracy against you. And one of the men that he took was a young fellow named Daniel. This is Daniel the prophet, and Daniel lived in Babylon for his entire life. We are told that he was there when Cyrus the Persian came. This is 65 years later. Daniel was still alive, and if he was 14 or 15 when he was taken as a hostage, he's in his 80s by this time. So Daniel lived a very long life, with most of his prophecy taking place in the early part of his life. The image that we get of him in the book of Daniel later on is that he was old and retired and was no longer prophesying. So anyway, Daniel was taken, Nebuchadnezzar left, and for a couple of years, Jehoiakim paid his tribute like he's supposed to. But then what does the Bible say? He became the vassal of Nebuchadnezzar for 3 years, but then he changed his mind and he rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. He rebelled against the Babylonians. You have to wonder sometimes about the political, and he was a paganist. They had reverted back to a pagan worship at that time. So, fortunately for Jehoiakim, he died. He'd been on the throne 11 years. He died, and his son Jehoiakim took the throne. He had only been on the throne for 3 months when, what do you think happened? Nebuchadnezzar, very angry at this point, reappears with his army for the second time. Now, he was coming to get Jehoiakim, but Jehoiakim, fortunately for him probably, had just died. And now his young son's on the throne and has to pay the price for when Nebuchadnezzar arrives with the Babylonian army. He takes Jehoiakim off the throne after 3 months, takes him back to Babylon, and we read later on that he was in prison for many years, but at the end of his life was allowed out of prison and was allowed to eat at the king's table at the end of his life. So Jehoiakim is gone, and Nebuchadnezzar puts his uncle on the throne, Mattaniah, and gives him a new throne name. This happened a lot. And his name's Zedekiah. And what does Nebuchadnezzar do? He says, "You are now my vassal. No more conspiring with the Egyptians. Pay your tribute, go to bed at night, and don't cause problems." And when he leaves, he takes treasure from the temple. He's torn down the gates. He's done some damage to the city of Jerusalem at this point. Well, what do you think happened? Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. He conspired with the Egyptians for a while. You have to consider perhaps that the Egyptians were right down the road, and they were more powerful than the city of Jerusalem, and maybe there was no choice. Maybe they determined that they could, in fact, rebel against Babylon and break free. But for whatever reason, Zedekiah, who again was a terrible paganist, we're told, rebelled against the king of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar came back a third time. This would have been after 9 years. And he initiated what was almost a 2-year siege against Jerusalem. And we're told what a terrible siege this was. We've talked about that. People starved. They reverted to cannibalism. They had disease. The siege lasted for a year and a half. The city fell. We are told that it was so terrible that people starved. We are given that little clue in the Bible. And at the very end, Zedekiah sneaked out of the city. He was able to do so, and he fled, but was tracked down by the army, by the soldiers of Nebuchadnezzar. It says he was taken to Nebuchadnezzar, wherever their headquarters were, their military headquarters, and they killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. Then they put out his eyes, bound him, and took him to Babylon. In other words, the very last thing he saw before he was blinded was his sons being slaughtered. He was taken to Babylon as a slave, and we don't know how he died or how long he survived, but he would have been a blind prisoner and a slave for his rebellion against Nebuchadnezzar. And then Nebuchadnezzar wanted, obviously, to make an example. And it says they spared neither young man nor young woman, old man or aged. They went through the city slaughtering everybody they met. It says they set fire to the temple. They broke down the wall of Jerusalem. They burned all the palaces and destroyed everything of value. In other words, they destroyed the city. And as an aside, how do you destroy the walls of a city? The way you do it is you get up on top with soldiers with crowbars. The walls are made with footlocker-sized stones or bigger. And you pry those stones off, and they go crashing down to the ground. And as you work your way down, the pile of dislodged stones is building up till eventually you reach a point where you can't go any lower without carrying all this material away. So city walls were typically destroyed about halfway down. You still had the foundations. You still had intact walls at the bottom. When Nehemiah returned with Ezra and rebuilt the walls in 460 BC, he rebuilt the walls in literally a couple of months. And the question is, how do you rebuild a wall in a couple of months? Well, you have all the materials right there. You have towers here. He said, okay, this tribe, you're going to build between these walls, and you just kind of stack things back up again, which is why the top of the rebuilt walls look so shabby, whereas when you get about halfway down, you have walls that are original, as you can see in the Western Wall in Jerusalem. You can see Herodian stones that are still intact because they were never destroyed. they carried into exile the people who remained in the city, along with the rest of the populace. Now, how many people would have remained in the city? Very few. Most of them would have died. The upper class and the royalty would have been getting food, and they would have been taken care of perhaps a little better. But most of the people would have died, and those who survived would have been starving. They would have been in a terrible state. And if they're being taken 1,000 miles back to Babylon, most of them would not have survived the trip. It says they also took people along with the rest of the populace. That's people out in the countryside. Now, most of those would have been either dead or in a terrible state because the Assyrian army was there for a couple of years rampaging, looting, sacking, taking off their produce, taking off their animals. And so there were not, the countryside would have been severely depopulated by this terrible, terrible disaster that occurred. It says they left behind some of the poorest people of the land to work the vineyards and fields. If you've conquered a land and you carry everybody off and kill them, you have nobody to grow anything and to pay the taxes. So it says they left the workers. But the countryside would have descended into a terrible economic depression for a generation or more because all of the educated people, all of the nobility, all of the rulers, all of the people that had skills were carried off to Babylon. And actually they were taken into exile, not slavery, and within a generation they had become Babylonians. They were worshiping Yahweh, but they were Babylonian people, just as, say, the Irish and the Italian immigrants in the United States came here, retained their Irish culture, but became Americans. And so when it comes time for the return 50 years later, not very many of the original exiles would ever have returned. Not only would they have been too old, the adults, people 20, 30, 40 years old, they would have all died by the time the return began. The youngest people, the little children, would have died along the way, and those that survived would be 50, 60, 70 years old and wouldn't have remembered anything about Jerusalem anyway. So the people who went back would have been the children and the grandchildren of the original refugees who had been inspired by the stories that their parents were telling them, and they would have gone back to Jerusalem that way. It says Judah went into captivity away from her land. So we have the Babylonians who had conquered the kingdom of Judah and destroyed the city of Jerusalem, and the few people who survived and were able to make the trip were taken back to Babylon. And that's where they lived out the rest of their lives. Actually, becoming Babylonians, we had a Jewish population in that part of the world up until the 20th century. They were Jews, but they were people of that particular country. And then what happened? Well, we aren't told. We don't have any stories of Babylon in the Bible. We have the book of Daniel, which gives us glimpses of what was happening there. But if you move to the next historical book right after the book of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, it jumps to the Persian period, which is in 539 BC. This is about 50 years later, which was prophesied early on by Isaiah and Jeremiah. What happened was the Persians took over in 539. They took over the ancient world. These were people who had been subjugated by the Medes, a little group called Persians, and one of the sons of the leader of the Persians married a daughter of the king of the Medes. The entire Mede army went over to their child, who was named Cyrus. Cyrus defeated his grandfather. He defeated Turkey. He conquered the whole Mede territory, turned his attention within a couple of years to the Fertile Crescent, and when he died, his son conquered Egypt, and in the space of 25 years, this little group of Persians had conquered the entire world, becoming the first superpower. And we are told in Ezra, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, Yahweh moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation. This is Ezra 1:1. right at the very beginning. Cyrus conquered the Babylonians. It was a bloodless battle, incidentally. They almost sneaked into the city. The city was so big they were able to, if you read Herodotus, they were able to sneak in through the waterways that were gated. They were able to sneak into the city before anybody knew they were there, and there were people 2 days later that didn't know there'd been a change of government because the city was so big and they're over here partying and nothing happened. So it was a bloodless takeover. And then Cyrus immediately started to release the various captive peoples and said, any of you that want to return back to your homelands, feel free. This is 50 years later for the people of Judah, and as I said, most of them had died, but their children and grandchildren took the opportunity and went back. And then almost 100 and some years later, almost 100 and some years later, Ezra returned with a renewed version of the worship, and we have the origins of what would be modern Judaism at that time. However, this one statement about Cyrus, king of Persia, it says, the Lord, Yahweh, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he's appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem and Judah. Now, this is an astonishing claim. He's a pagan king from Persia, and he's claiming that Yahweh approached him and said, here's what I want you to do. So now we have to go back in the text. And we go back to the time of Isaiah. And if we read in Isaiah 45, it says, this was before the city of Samaria ever fell. This is way back in the time of Hezekiah. This is what Yahweh says to his anointed, to Cyrus, by name. I summon you by name and bestow on you a title of honor, though you do not acknowledge me. This is a prophecy of what God is going to say to Cyrus when he takes the throne, and this is being made 170 years earlier up in Jerusalem. And what is most astonishing is the word that's used. We translate it as anointed. The Hebrew word is Meshiach, Messiah. An anointed individual is somebody who is being given a special task by God. David was anointed. Solomon was anointed. The high priests are anointed. And of course, Jesus is the most important of the anointed. But he is using this term for a pagan king who's going to appear more than a century later. And he says that even though you do not acknowledge me, I'm going to do this, which again is an example of how God uses his creation to accomplish what it is that he has intended. And then it goes on to say that the Persians and the Assyrians and the Babylonians are all going to be punished as well, but he's going to use Cyrus at this point in history. And so we have the beginning of the return. We have people that went back, started to rebuild the temple, all of the problems that happened there for 20-some years until the time of a later king in Persia. The temple was eventually restored, but the faith that they took back another couple of generations later with Ezra was an organized and refined version of the faith of Yahweh that they had taken with them. While they were in Babylon for 50 years, they finally organized and refined their faith. They determined, for example, that God was omnipresent. The faith at the time they went was a temple-based faith. You had to go to the temple, you bought your offering, you gave it to a priest, and you could stand there and watch him sacrifice in your name, but you had to go to the temple because that's where God lived. That wasn't the house of God the way we view a church. It was his abode. And now the temple's destroyed. They're in Babylon. No hope in many of their minds of ever going back. How do we worship? They finally, at that point, conceptualized the fact that God is omnipresent. He's everywhere. And as a result, you can worship anywhere. And they developed the concept of the synagogue, which they took back with them. Most importantly, they had a collection of sacred writings that were scrolls. Many of them we no longer have. You read in the book of Kings, you have the words of the prophet so-and-so and the words of the seer so-and-so. Those are all gone. But what they did was they sat down and they said, which of these are the most important? which are the most sacred, which are the ones that we have to read to be good worshipers, and they created what would, at that time, was a recommended reading list that we call the Bible. It wasn't a book at that time, it was all these scrolls. And they came up with the original 39 names, 39 books that we have in our Old Testament. And over the next 500 years, they added books in and took them out and constantly were churning the process. But they began the process of creating the Bible. It took about 500 years before they stopped modifying it. And for that matter, it took us almost 400 years to stop modifying the various books that would be in the New Testament once the church leaders started deciding what would be included and what wouldn't. In other words, they have these books and then somebody else writes a new one and somebody would say, oh, that's good, we need to put that in. And they would come and go. So anyway, they started the Bible. They began commentary. They began examining the law and saying, how do we do this? Keep the Sabbath holy, what does that mean? Can we walk on the Sabbath? Well, yes, you must have to walk because the latrine in the city is 3/4 of a mile down the road. Or can we go up to the Mount of Olives? And so you have a Sabbath day walk, a certain distance. Are we allowed to cook? Are we allowed to eat? Can we talk? Can we read? What does it mean? And these commentaries began to be assembled, and they took those back as well. And those were the foundations of modern Judaism that we have today. So, we're back, but the Holy Land at that point was undergoing tremendous change. A young man by the name of Alexander conquered the Persians, and so now the Persian Empire is a Greek empire. Alexander died very quickly. His kingdom was broken up into pieces, all of which were Greek-like for the next 300 years. But then a very powerful group called Romans appeared, conquered the Holy Land in 63 BC, just a couple of generations before Jesus was born. And we're now in the New Testament. So that was a 30-second view of the intertestamental period. And I think we're going to quit now, and thank you very much for your attention.